There's a two-word phrase sitting on ice cream containers all over the frozen aisle right now, usually printed in a smaller font right next to the flavor name, and most people walk past it every single week without ever reading it. Those two words are the reason a company can legally pull the cream out of a product, replace it with vegetable oil and a stack of chemical gums, whip extra air into what's left, and still put a picture of real cream pouring across the front of the label. The phrase is frozen dairy dessert. Once you know what that phrase actually means, you can't walk past it again without noticing. You'll start seeing it on tubs you've bought for years, sitting right there under a brand name you trusted enough to never bother reading the fine print in the first place. Here's the rule behind it. To legally use the words ice cream on a package in the United States, a product has to contain at least 10% milk fat and at least 20% total milk solids. That's the federal standard of identity, the one most people casually call the USDA rule, and it's the single number that explains almost everything on the list you're about to hear. Fall short of that threshold and the label has to change to frozen dairy dessert, frozen dessert, or something close to it. Everything we're about to cover either fails that number outright, gets close enough to it that the rest of the formula has to compensate with sweeteners and stabilizers, or comes with a safety record serious enough that the formula stops being the main issue. Keep that one number in your head as we go. It explains almost every entry that follows, even the ones that seem, on the surface, to be about something else entirely. We're counting down 12 brands worth putting back on the shelf, starting with the smaller problems and building toward the ones with real consequences. Then we flip it and give you 6 brands that looked at that same regulation and made a completely different choice. Worst is saved for last, so if you only remember one entry, stick around for it. Let's get into it. Number 12, great value. Walmart's house brand of ice cream is priced to move. It's consistently one of the cheapest tubs in the entire freezer aisle, and the ingredient panel is where a lot of that price gets made up. It lists multiple added sweeteners stacked on top of each other, the kind of stacking that shows up when a formula is trying to recover flavor that milk fat was supposed to provide on its own. Alongside that, it leans on synthetic emulsifiers like mono and diglycerides, additives that hold a frozen product's structure together when there isn't quite enough fat to do that job naturally. Real ice cream, made with enough cream, doesn't need chemical help standing up in the tub. Great Value does still clear the federal 10% milk fat line, so technically it earns the name on the label. But barely clearing a legal floor isn't the same thing as a good product, and you can taste the difference in the texture. A faintly icy, gritty scrape across the tongue that shows up specifically when fat content is too low to build a smooth, stable structure on its own. Given the price point, that's a defensible trade-off if you know what you're buying going in. The real issue is a label that doesn't make that trade-off obvious to anyone grabbing the tub on their way through the store. The next brand on this list used to build its entire identity around not having that problem. Then a new owner changed the formula and kept the old branding exactly as it was. Number 11, Breyers. For decades, Breyers built its identity around 2 words, all natural. That promise was part of the brand's DNA long before Unilever bought the company and quietly reformulated what was inside the container. Milk fat dropped below the legal ice cream threshold across much of the lineup, and real cream was replaced with a blend of stabilizers, Terra gum, carabine gum, and others, doing the structural work that fat used to handle on its own. Most of what carries the Breyers name on shelves today is legally classified as frozen dairy dessert, not ice cream. The branding didn't move an inch through any of this. Same logo, same fonts, same colors on the container. Only what's actually inside changed. And Breyers didn't just slide through that shift unnoticed. It ended up in court over it. A lawsuit alleged the company falsely represented its products as containing real vanilla when the formula didn't back that claim up. Unilever settled for $8.85 million. That is not a rounding error or an honest labeling mistake that slipped through. That's a company agreeing to pay an 8-figure settlement because the claim on the label couldn't survive scrutiny in court. For a brand that built decades of loyalty on the promise of being the honest, simple option in the case, that's the kind of outcome that's hard to walk back. Number 10, Dreyer's. Sold as Edie's, depending on which side of the country you're shopping in. Dreyer's has been making ice cream since the 1920s and co-created Rocky Road, and that long history is part of why the lawsuits against it landed as hard as they did. One class action alleged the company's vanilla ice cream was marketed as though it came from real vanilla beans, when the ingredient list actually just said natural flavor, with nothing on the package specifying vanilla bean at all. A separate class action targeted a chocolate-coated novelty bar distributed by Dreyer's Grand Ice Cream, alleging the chocolate shell wasn't chocolate at all. It was vegetable oil and coconut oil finished with artificial vanilla flavoring standing in for the real thing. Then there's the slow-churned line, marketed as lower fat and lower calorie. To make up for the fat that gets removed, the formula adds meaningfully more sugar back in, which means you're not really getting a healthier product. You're trading one problem for a different one and calling it an upgrade. Like Breyers, much of the modern Dreyers in Edie's lineup has since been reclassified as frozen dairy dessert rather than ice cream. Two separate lawsuits over two separate ingredients on a brand with almost a century of history behind it is a pattern worth noticing rather than a coincidence worth excusing. Number 9. Good humor. Good humor sells nostalgia harder than almost anyone in this category. The jingle, the truck, the strawberry shortcake bar, half the country grew up eating off the porch in summer. Look closely at what's actually inside that bar, and the nostalgia gets complicated fast. The base uses non-fat milk instead of cream, built out with corn syrup, palm oil, soybean oil, coconut oil, and a handful of stabilizing gums doing the work cream would normally do. The chocolate-looking crunch coating isn't chocolate at all. It's coconut oil, finished with an artificial vanilla substitute standing in for cocoa. And the strawberry shortcake bar specifically contains red dye number 3, a synthetic color additive that the FDA has formally confirmed causes cancer in laboratory animals. In January 2025, the FDA moved to ban red 3 from the food supply entirely, but manufacturers were given until January 2027 to reformulate around it, which means right now it's still legally allowed to sit inside that bar on store shelves. You're paying for a frozen dairy dessert with a chocolate coating that contains no real chocolate, wrapped around a color additive the government has already decided has to go. This is a brand whose marketing leans hard on childhood memory and the trust of parents standing near an ice cream truck with kids in tow. That makes an ingredient with a documented carcinogenic profile in animal studies a much bigger deal than it would be if it were buried in an adult snack aisle. Number 8. Turkey Hill. Turkey Hill spent years building a reputation as the brand parents trusted without a second thought. Premium ingredients, honest marketing, the safe choice in the freezer aisle. That trust took real hits, twice, in ways that had nothing to do with formula and everything to do with what actually ended up in the container. In 2016, the company recalled tubs labeled Dutch chocolate ice cream that had actually been filled with Rocky Road instead, a flavor that contains almonds and eggs. For a family managing a nut allergy or an egg allergy, that isn't a minor labeling slip. That's a trip to the emergency room waiting to happen. Then in 2022, it happened again on a different flavor. Containers labeled chocolate marshmallow were found to actually contain chocolate peanut butter cup ice cream, another undeclared allergen, this time peanuts. Both incidents were classified as Class 1 recalls, the FDA's most serious category reserved specifically for situations where there's a reasonable probability that using the product will cause serious health consequences. Two separate allergen mix-ups on two different flavors, 6 years apart, isn't one unlucky production run. That's a labeling and quality control process that failed the exact same way twice. For anyone managing a real allergy in their household, premium branding means nothing if the label on the tub can't be trusted to describe what's actually inside it. We're about a third of the way through this list. If it's helping you shop smarter, a quick like helps more people see this before they're standing in that aisle guessing. Number 7, Klondike. Klondike is a Unilever brand, the same parent company behind Breyers, and it's followed a strikingly similar playbook. Keep the premium bar imagery, keep the pricing exactly where it's always been, quietly change what's actually inside the wrapper. The classic Crunch Bar's ingredient list leads with non-fat milk and coconut oil, not cream, followed by corn syrup solids, fructose, and a combination of tara gum, gar gum, and locust bean gum. 4 separate stabilizing gums working together to hold one bar together. Real cream holds its shape because of milk fat content. Gums get added to a formula specifically when there isn't enough fat left to do that structural job on its own. Most of the modern Klondike lineup has been reclassified as frozen dairy dessert, the same shift Breyers went through under the same corporate ownership. For a bar built around the image of a classic American treat, what's actually inside the wrapper has drifted a long way from that picture, even if the packaging never let on. Same parent company, same reformulation playbook, same decision to let the branding do the talking, while the ingredient panel tells a different story. Number 6. Blue Bunny. Blue Bunny, made by Wells Enterprises, had a rough spring in 2025. In April, the company issued a voluntary recall of nearly 17,800 containers of ice cream and frozen yogurt after discovering they could contain fragments of hard plastic, a contamination risk tied specifically to dental injury and choking. It's worth being precise here. Wells Enterprises has been owned by Ferrero since 2022, not Unilever, which makes it a wholly separate company from Klondike and Breyers, even though the underlying quality problems rhyme uncomfortably well. Beyond the recall itself, most Blue Bunny offerings sit in the frozen dairy dessert category rather than qualifying as legal ice cream, built around stabilizing gums and modified starches rather than a full cream base. A hard plastic recall touching close to 18,000 containers isn't a footnote you skim past in a press release. It's the kind of failure that belongs at the front of any conversation about whether this brand has earned your trust, no matter how many decades it's been sitting in the same spot in your grocery store's freezer case. Number 5. Ben & Jerry's. Ben & Jerry's has spent decades cultivating an image built on fair trade sourcing, social causes, and the general sense that this is a company doing business differently than everyone else in the freezer case. Flip one of their pints over, though, and the ingredient list tells a far more familiar story. Sugar, liquid sugar, corn syrup, molasses, and honey, sometimes several of those stacked into a single flavor at once. Chunky Monkey, for example, carries up to roughly 32 grams of added sugar in a single serving. The American Heart Association recommends staying under somewhere around 25 to 30 grams of added sugar a day for most adults. One serving of one flavor can put you at or over that entire daily ceiling before you finish the bowl. That's a genuine nutritional tension sitting underneath a brand whose entire public identity is built on the idea that it holds itself to a higher standard than the rest of this list. None of this makes Ben & Jerry's dishonest about where its cream or its cocoa comes from. It just means the values on the outside of the pint and the sugar content on the inside of it are 2 separate conversations, and the marketing only ever wants you having one of them. Number 4, Baskin-Robbins. Baskin-Robbins used to mean something specific. 31 flavors, a genuine destination, a reason to make the trip on a Friday night. 2 things have quietly eroded that over time. First, the brand continues to lean on high fructose corn syrup across much of its lineup, long after plenty of competitors made a point of dropping it. Second, several of its flavors carry synthetic food dyes from the same group that, under European Union regulation, legally requires a mandatory warning label stating the product may have an adverse effect on activity and attention in children. That warning requirement has been law across the EU since 2010. In the United States, the same dyes go on shelves with no equivalent disclosure required anywhere on the package. Add it together. Meaningful added sugar, high fructose corn syrup still in the mix, and dyes flagged seriously enough to require a childhood behavior warning label on the other side of the Atlantic. The gap between the Baskin-Robbins people remember and the Baskin-Robbins actually sitting in the case today gets hard to ignore. Nothing here is contamination or recall territory. It's a slower kind of erosion. The sort that happens gradually enough that regulars keep coming back out of habit long after the product stopped matching the memory. Number 3, Dairy Queen. Here's something Dairy Queen has been quietly counting on for close to 85 years. That you won't stop and actually ask what's in the soft serve. Their own website answers the question directly in their own words. Technically, our soft serve does not qualify to be called ice cream. To be categorized as ice cream, the minimum butterfat content must be 10%, and our soft serve has only 5% butterfat content, half the legal minimum. Every blizzard, every dipped cone, every soft serve cup ever sold at a Dairy Queen, served at a location deliberately designed to look and feel like an ice cream shop decade after decade, is, by the company's own admission, a frozen dairy dessert. This isn't a hidden loophole the company is hoping nobody stumbles onto. It's written on their own website in plain language for anyone who bothers to look. Almost nobody does, and Dairy Queen has never had much reason to bring it up on the menu board where you're actually placing your order. Number 2, Bluebell. Bluebell is close to a cultural institution across the American South, the kind of brand people will defend with real emotion, which is exactly why 2015 landed the way it did. A listeria outbreak was traced directly back to Bluebell's own production facilities. 10 people were hospitalized across multiple states, and 3 died in Kansas. The company issued what became the largest ice cream recall in United States history, roughly 8 million gallons pulled off shelves nationwide, essentially the entire product line. In 2020, Bluebell Creameries pleaded guilty and agreed to pay $19.35 million total, $17.25 million in criminal fines and forfeiture, plus another $2.1 million to resolve separate civil claims. The company's former CEO was criminally charged over what happened. This was never framed as an accident that slipped past an otherwise good system. It was a contamination failure serious enough to end in a guilty plea and a criminal case against the person running the company. A brand with that specific history doesn't get to be treated as just another tub sitting quietly in the freezer next to everything else. And the scrutiny didn't end in 2020. In 2025, half-gallon tubs labeled as one flavor were found to actually contain Millennium Crunch ice cream instead, a flavor that contains tree nuts, another undeclared allergen. No injuries were reported that time. But a company that paid nearly $20 million to resolve a contamination scandal tied to 3 deaths doesn't get the benefit of the doubt on a second mislabeling event a few years later. Number 1, Halo Top. Halo Top built its entire brand around a single number, an entire pint clocking in somewhere between 280 and 360 calories, printed in large type on every container it ever sold. Millions of people bought pints believing they could eat the whole thing in one sitting without much consequence, and that belief was the entire business model. Here's how that number got that low in the first place. The primary sweetener doing the heavy lifting is erythritol, a sugar alcohol that adds real sweetness with very little caloric impact. A 2023 study out of the Cleveland Clinic, published in the journal Nature Medicine, found that people with higher levels of erythritol circulating in their blood had an elevated risk of serious cardiac events, heart attack, stroke, even death, and that erythritol appears to make platelets more likely to clump together and form clots. Research has linked erythritol to that elevated cardiovascular risk. It isn't proof that any single pint causes it, but it's a serious association to weigh against a product whose entire marketing pitch is built on encouraging you to eat the whole pint in one sitting. The second issue is simpler: air. A meaningful share of that reduced calorie count came from whipping extra air into every pint, which means less actual ice cream sits inside a container that looks the exact same size as anything else in the case. That gap between appearance and contents was large enough to trigger a class action lawsuit in 2018, alleging Halo Top dramatically underfilled its pints. Claims a federal court allowed to largely proceed in 2019 rather than dismiss outright. A health halo built on an ingredient linked to real cardiovascular risk, wrapped around a container that may not hold what its own label implies it holds. That's why this one takes the number 1 spot. Now that you know what to put back, here are 6 brands that looked at that exact same regulation and made a completely different choice. Number 6, Van Leeuwen. Van Leeuwen started as a single yellow ice cream truck parked on a Brooklyn Street corner back in 2008, and it's since grown into a name found in thousands of stores nationwide. Its vanilla contains about 7 ingredients total: milk, cream, cane sugar, egg yolks, vanilla extract, salt, and vanilla bean. No gums anywhere on the label, no corn syrup, no stabilizer blend quietly doing the work cream is supposed to do, and no small print reclassification hiding on the front of the container. It's about as close to the classic simple formula as a brand operating at national scale gets, which is exactly why it's worth the slightly higher price tag over most of what's sitting in the avoid pile. Number 5, Talenti. One distinction worth understanding before you grab a jar. Gelato isn't technically ice cream. It's churned with less air and served at a slightly warmer temperature than ice cream, which makes it noticeably denser and more intensely flavored scoop for scoop. Talenti introduced a huge number of people to what real gelato actually tastes like when it's done properly, made with real cream, real milk, and real egg yolks, without high fructose corn syrup anywhere in the formula, and sold in transparent jars that let you actually see the texture and the mix-ins before you commit to buying it. That's the opposite instinct of a brand trying to keep you from looking too closely at what's inside. Number 4, Häagen-Dazs. The classic Häagen-Dazs vanilla has held to just 5 ingredients for decades now: cream, skim milk, sugar, egg yolks, and vanilla extract. No gums, no artificial flavoring, no high fructose corn syrup anywhere near it. That simplicity is specifically true of the classic vanilla bean pint. Other items across the wider lineup can vary. But for a national brand operating at that scale to keep a formula that plain for that long, while so much of the rest of this category was quietly adding stabilizers and cutting fat, says something real about the choice being made behind it. It's proof that a 5-ingredient formula can still work at full supermarket scale. It just requires a company willing to leave milk fat where it belongs instead of engineering around it. Number 3, Straus Family Creamery. Straus is a family-owned, certified organic operation, and that shows up directly in what's on the label. Nothing bioengineered, no preservatives, no filler ingredients, standing in for real cream. In a blind taste test run by the San Francisco Chronicle, Straus's vanilla bean ice cream was named the best vanilla in the entire tasting. That's the kind of result that's genuinely hard to fake with a bag of stabilizers, and it lines up with everything else about the operation. A small organic family-run creamery competing on taste against companies with national ad budgets and coming out ahead in a blind test where the branding on the container couldn't influence the result. Number 2, Tillamook. Tillamook is a farmer-owned cooperative that's been operating for well over a century, which means the people making the sourcing decisions are the exact same people producing the milk that goes into the product. According to the company, Tillamook ice cream exceeds the legal standard for ice cream rather than sliding under it. No reclassification to frozen dairy dessert anywhere in the core lineup. It's also one of the more widely available and reasonably priced options on this entire list, which is a big part of why it holds up so well as an everyday, grab-it-every-week recommendation rather than an occasional treat. If you only take one brand off this entire video and change what's in your cart, Tillamook is the easiest swap to make. It's sitting in the same freezer case you already shop in. Number 1, Jenny's Splendid Ice Creams. Jenny Britton Bauer founded Jenny's in Columbus, Ohio, in 2002 by rethinking the base of ice cream almost from first principles. Instead of relying on egg yolks the way traditional custard-style ice cream normally does, Jenny's developed its own proprietary base using cream cheese and tapioca starch, a formulation specifically built to stay smooth and structurally stable without crystallizing, rather than leaning on the same gum blends that show up throughout most of the avoid list. It's a different engineering approach to the category, not just a marketing angle, and it's exactly why Jenny's lands at the very top of this list. So here's the single most useful thing to take away from this entire investigation. The next time you're standing in the freezer aisle, before anything goes into the cart, do one thing first. Look at the front of the package. If it says frozen dairy dessert, frozen dessert, or anything other than the words ice cream. That product is legally operating under a lower milk fat standard with a lot more room built in for stabilizers. Then flip it over and scan the ingredient list for carrageenan, xanthan gum, guar gum, tara gum, locust bean gum, carob bean gum, or modified food starch. Any single one of those tells you the dairy in that container isn't doing the structural work entirely on its own. Something else has been brought in to hold it together. The more of them stacked into one product, the wider that gap usually is between what the picture on the front promises and what's actually inside. It takes about 10 seconds, standing right there in the aisle, and it works on every single brand in this entire freezer section, not just the 12 we walked through today. Real ice cream still exists on ordinary store shelves, sitting right next to everything else. Tillamook sits in the same freezer case as most of the brands on the avoid list. Van Leeuwen is in Walmart. Häagen-Dazs Classic Vanilla is stocked in nearly every grocery store in the country. None of it requires a specialty trip or a premium-only budget to track down. It just requires reading 2 words that most people have walked straight past their entire lives on packaging designed, in a lot of cases, to make sure they kept walking past them. 10% milk fat. Frozen dairy dessert. Now you know exactly what those 2 facts mean the next time you're standing in front of that case, deciding what goes in the cart. If this changed how you're going to shop, share it with someone who still grabs the tub without ever checking.